I'm not kidding here. I'm not
It's your
kidding.
15 minutes.
Okay, future generation.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and call the...
Wait, no. We've got to be on camera first.
No, we don't. Okay, you're going to jail.
Wanna go down? All right, so we're going to go ahead and call the order of the meeting tonight for the Thursday, August 22nd meeting. First item on the agenda tonight is going to be the approval of the minutes, then regular business. We're going to talk about the mobility master plan and then the proposed Old Town code amendments. Both are informational, so no recommendations tonight. First thing on the list is the approval of the minutes. Do I hear a motion for the approval of the minutes?
I'd like to make a motion for approval of meeting minutes from August 8th.
Okay, do I ever hear a second?
Second.
Excellent. All in favor?
Aye.
Any abstentions or nays? Nope. Okay, motion passes. Motion passes. Minutes pass.
All good.
Okay. And now we're going to go ahead and have our guest speakers from the city with Christopher and Kristen.
No, first it's Stephen,
Kristen, Stephen.
Stephen is first.
our first special guest.
Okay, excellent. Kristen, Stephen. Go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
I like having guest speakers.
I know. Let's do this first.
Let's just consult it right out.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Padua. I'm a senior transportation planner with Public Works Engineering. And the handout I just gave to all of you is a handout of Sunset Way. There was a question posed to me that you all had, I think, at your previous meeting on the design for Sunset Way and about parking. What you see in front of you, the 4 concept designs, is where we last left off with the traffic task force on Sunset Way. So there was no actual conceptual design selected and move forward for further design. So that's actually where we're at now is the next step on Sunset Way is to actually decide on which conceptual design we want to select. Right now, on the back side of your sheet, I put where it is in the TIP. It's in the unfunded years, further past beyond the 6-year planning timeframe. So really, it could come at any time. But it is unfunded, and it's a $15 million project. Is there any additional questions on that?
How do you decide on the final concept?
That's going to be part of the next process, is deciding, one, how to decide and who decides it.
Okay.
And you said that's I didn't hear what you had said. You said it's unfunded?
Right now, it's recognized as a project in our TIP, but it's in the unfunded years. So it's not really in our planning horizon.
We're looking 6 years, 10 years out.
It's not within the next 6 years. That's as much as I can say, really, because after that, it can come really pretty much any time.
Got it.
Enroll plan.
Okay.
Excellent, thank you.
No questions? I'll move on to my presentation. So for this presentation, we're going to try something new. I have a new tool with our communications department, and I'm going to need you to bring out your smartphones because there is actually interactive questions as part of this presentation that'll actually help me collect feedback.
Whoa.
Wonder if somebody needs
Staff too?
So bring out your smartphone if you have one, and go to the website that's at the top of the screen. It's mentee.com.
Is it staff? Well, no, then it would come from you though. Staff too, Stephen, or just the commissioners?
Just the commission.
Okay.
I mean, you can interact too if you want.
Like it is a
And then once you get to that website from the browser on your smartphone, enter the 6 digits also at the top of the screen, and then I'll bring you straight to the presentation.
Oh, very.
And it'll follow along as I go through the presentation. For those of you who don't have your smartphone, I am taking notes as we kind of talk about everything
Look,
too.
a heart just went up.
As you've noticed, there are little hearts. If there are particular screens that you like, it actually helps me with these presentations because I'm going to multiple boards and commissions to talk about this. So it actually helps me with editing a lot of these pages.
Well, this is so fun.
So to test this out, let's go with a really quick question.
Oh.
What year did this community become a town?
Oh.
1892. The town of Gilman was formed in 1892.
Meant to hit that.
One more question. What year did Issaquah become a code city?
Code City. Oh, it's so recent. Oh, 72 now. Ooh.
Heads? 1972.
All right.
Really?
So in the year 1959, the city of Issaquah actually became a smaller sized city. It basically just upgraded when its population reached a certain size. 1972, it became a code city and became the form of government that it is today. I promise this is relevant to my presentation.
That's good. About
One more
annexations.
question. How did you get here today?
Oh, there is no right answer, right?
Okay.
Nice.
I'll bring this up later on as we kind of talk.
Whoa.
So today, I am going to talk about the mobility master plan and give you a quick update as I'm giving my presentation. But I'm also going to give you a quick history on transportation and as it relates to how Issaquah developed to what it is today. I'm also going to talk about multimodal transportation, which is the direction that the city is actually heading, similar to a lot of other cities in our region. Then I'm also, as we go through the presentation, I'm going to go through my policy questions, which relates to how we're developing the mobility master plan. So on transportation and development of Issaquah, it really goes back to the expansion of the highway system. Back in the 1950s, a lot of how the cities were connected were smaller rural roads. After that, the U.S. government pushed for a huge highway system to better connect all of our states, cities, and counties. So we could better connect it, more of an emergency management system, but it became more than that. It became more of a connection between a lot of our communities. Families connect with families, and friends connect with friends. When you pair that with mass development of suburban neighborhoods, you get what a lot of our cities look like today. And a lot of that, and I bring up a lot of that because it led to what we call autocentric design to a lot of our cities. All of our cities have developed very similar ways. Different topographies and geographies kind of help define each community's and its culture. But it's all very similar in terms that we have to go everywhere designed by going through a vehicle. When you look at today, what's changed between the 1950s and today? Population growth. It is increasing every year. Technology is advancing beyond what most of us can keep up with. There's increasing concerns with environmental health and regional congestions on everybody's mind, particularly in Issaquah. And I bring all this up because we're actually changing our mindset of how we handle transportation. Multimodal transportation, some of you might have heard, is the offering of multiple options. But what they typically forget when they're talking about multimodal transportation is the foundational concepts behind it, which is focusing on moving people and the goods. Is how do we use the space we have more efficiently? Because we have reached the peak of the design of the car and how much we can move in our roadways, in our right-of-way, and in the capacity of our network. And what I mean by reach our peak, when we all travel between places, particularly the peak hours and the early in the afternoon, we've reached capacity, which is what is traffic congestion, and it is broadening every year. And so what multimodal transportation really means is focusing much more investment on transit, walking, and riding your bike. But one common misconception with multimodal transportation is people often think that it excludes auto investments, and that's not true. It's just not the main purpose of multimodal transportation. Now, this type of transportation isn't new. We actually have policies in the comp plan pushing for multimodal transportation. All the cities around us have policies related to pushing multimodal. It's either very transparent, or it's kind of hidden in throughout the policies in each of the chapters of their comprehensive plans. But and the reason for this push in our region to go multimodal transportation, because they've all recognized about that peak and being able to maximize the use of our right-of-way and how we can move people and goods. So that brings me to the mobility master plan. The reason why that we are working on this is because a lot of the policies haven't really been fully implemented or done effectively. And so we want to look at how reevaluate a lot of those policies so that it's better coordinating with our other planning documents. And then how we look a little bit deeper at what multimodal transportation actually means in this city. It'll contain all the same elements as our transportation, as the transportation element in the comp plan. It'll have the vision, the goals, policies, even action items to look at how do we move this form of transportation forward in the city. So that brings me to the first question. What are your concerns with multimodal transportation system? And you can either tell me or you can go on the phone and kind of enter it in and we can talk about the answers as they go on the screen. One of the first questions is there isn't enough fixed transit. And that's typically the transit you see, the big buses that kind of travel in and out. The second question, there isn't enough transit options. That's around more of the carpool options, van pool, different types of options that connect you to transit. Walking, biking doesn't feel safe. This is a common issue that I hear from residents whenever we go to talk to community members about multimodal transportation. It's not financially feasible. People kind of compare multimodal transportation as how we've been handling the system currently. It seems abundantly clear that all these major infrastructure projects cost a lot of money. When you go towards multimodal transportation, you actually look at more feasible and more efficient means of using the funds you have. And then people only want to drive their car, and we can talk about that in a little bit. Are there any additional answers? Anything that's actually not on the screen that's a concern about multimodal transportation? Okay. Now, with thinking about the concerns, what are good strategies for adopting a multimodal transportation system? I've gone over a little bit today, but I want to get your feedback or your thoughts on what you think would help with adapting to a multimodal transportation system. The first option is more transit options, going to that similar complaint that we heard, or at least what we saw on the previous slide. More intentional land use. The idea behind that is that transportation is better paired with the land use that's intended, particularly with the zoning of the city. More walkable areas. With this, yes, it's embedded in a lot of the policies that we want walkable areas in the city. But what's not really talked about is what does that actually mean? And when you talk to community members, that means a whole different set of things than when you talk to an engineer or even a planner. More bicycle infrastructure. A lot of the community advocates or a lot of our residents who ride a bike complain that there's just not enough facilities or diversity of facilities supporting the type of use for the bike that they want to choose. Is there anything additional that's not on the screen?
When you say more transit options, what do you mean by transit options? I mean, I understand the words, but what are you thinking about when you pose that as a strategy?
It's either adding more routes throughout the city, or it's how to find ways to connect to transit without actually having to drive your car. King County Metro and Sound Transit are exploring different programs on how to more efficiently and more effectively get people to use transit without having to get them to go to the park and rides.
So are you considering things like electric bicycles? Is that a transit option?
It is.
Okay, so that's broad brush.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very broad stroke of how can we better connect people with transit, kind of the fixed transit routes.
I think when I see more transit options, I tend to think, how am I getting out of Issaquah and going to another location? So in relation to your unlisted issue, I would really say, how are we getting around in Issaquah? Is it possible to actually be able to go up to the Highlands? Can we be in Old Town, go to Gilman without needing to use a car continuously in our city? So I think that's kind of a sub area that maybe necessarily isn't think about, because you don't think about hopping on a bus to get up and down just within Issaquah.
Right.
So I think of something something like Denver and the free tram that runs to like 2 a.m. And it makes it really easy to be able to go throughout the city, and something like that, like, let's expand our trolley kind of a thing. So when I think of an unlisted issue, that's kind of where I come from.
That's perfect. Is there anything else that's kind of missing off the screen that I have?
I'm waiting to see what the let's discuss next slide is.
I would,
Actually, on the phone, you can actually enter a lot of that. But when you're talking, I am taking the notes, so it will be something that's incorporated as part of this. So on the idea of the trolley, so transit is a very complicated term because most people relate it to a lot of the fixed transit, the bus that's outside now. But what people don't realize is there's transit within a lot of our communities. I don't know if you've heard of the Community Connections Program that's currently been deployed in Issaquah. That is, how do we connect? And even though it's primarily focused on connecting people to our transit centers, a lot of those services in other areas have been used to connect to downtown commercial areas or connect hard-to-get neighborhoods to any other types of services or goods that typically they would have to drive for. And it provides affordable option with basically an Orca pass and a bus fare to be able to use those type of services. And so it's those type of expansion and ideas that we are looking for. And Metro is piloting a lot of these projects in different areas because they've realized every area is a little different. Highlands, how do you connect with Highlands is going to be a lot different than how you connect with Sycamore or even Sammamish. So even going to other cities, you're going to be connecting a little bit differently. Yes?
Stephen, I'm not sure, I apologize ahead of time. The single biggest transportation-related issue that I used to be on the Development Commission, and this came up a couple of times, is where the terminus is going to be for the light rail system. And my understanding is that other cities that have the same basically schedule for getting mass transit, light rail to their cities, have already designated where that terminal is going to be and tried to figure out some of the parking for this terminus. And that discussion came up because, and I hadn't realized it until the discussion happened, that it makes sense that when that happens, when that terminus is there, people are going to come from all over eastern King County to park so they can use that terminus. And it's a huge issue. And we asked a couple of times, and that's been a while. So I guess I would say that is, to me, that's the biggest single transportation issue that's facing the city.
No, I think that's a really important point because it's going to be such a huge infrastructure feat for us, but also for Washtenaw Sound Transit to bring the light rail service out to Issaquah. And all these other cities and the communities are right to be figuring out where light rail is, and we are on that track to go to that. The plan for us right now is to get through this mobility master plan and kind of discover that vision, and then eventually we're going to start working on a transit plan after the adoption of this plan. And that'll, throughout the development of that plan, we're going to have discussions on light rail and what it means to have not just talk about the terminus for light rail, but also the full network of how do we get buses to reroute or design the bus routes to fully support and maximize the efficiency of light rail coming to Issaquah so that we're not fully dependent on building parking structures to support light rail.
Is it just part of the equation? Is one factor in this theoretical equation use of eminent domain?
I'm sorry?
Use of eminent domain to secure the actual land that is going to be needed for this? Is that, I assume that's one tool in the toolkit.
Yes, but I mean, that's a tool in the toolkit for a lot of things, not just light rail.
Oh yeah, I realize that, but I assume it's something this massive is going to have to utilize at least some of it.
It doesn't necessarily need to come to that. With having community discussions, we have a lot of time to talk about it, and what I mean by a lot of time, we have a few years until Sound Transit's actually ready to talk to us about light rail. But that's plenty of time for us to have community discussions on what do we want from light rail and how do we get that without having to spend the most money from the community on parking that's going to benefit people who don't live in the city, and how do we fulfill a lot of the other goals and visions that we have in the other parts of the comprehensive plan. We have art, we have environmental health, we have human services. There's an equity component to the people in our community and how they access a lot of our transit services. So we have a bit of time to talk about all of that, which is great, because it's going to take a little bit of time.
I will say, we've talked about it on several occasions in different mediums, whether it was when we were touring around neighborhoods or with staff or here in meetings, and eminent domain has never actually been one of the lead priorities or necessities for all the different options. So I do want to say that that's pretty low, I think, on the list of things at this point in a discussion.
Yeah. Are there any other points? Yes.
When you're thinking about when these issues are being thought about, are you building in financial integrity? Is that part of the consideration, or is right now, is it greenfield discussion, and then we'll figure out the money later on? And because it's an issue in a town like this or an area like this, which is not really very high density, even though we think it is.
When talking light rail or just transportation in general?
I'm talking, you're posing
Everything,
general
okay.
questions, so I'm coming back with that general.
Yes. Typically, when we're looking at transportation projects, we are tailoring it to the funding that's available, or the funding that we could acquire as part of the project. So maybe we plan it a few years out with the intention of going for grant money to support the project, with some local money to support it. So usually, those are pretty intense conversations to make sure that we're getting every detail and we're making sure that we can support it. Anything else before I move on? You want me to talk about that, or we can move on to the next slide? So land use and transportation. I'm coming to you today because you have talked about land use policy, and you have more experience than I do on Issaquah's land use policy. But now I want to pose the questions of how do we now support the policies that we have for land use or transportation to now complement each other? Because a lot of what I do for transportation is completely affected by land use, and vice versa. A lot of how people choose to move around impacts the type of land use that kind of go in areas. So common type of policies that usually come up when you're talking land use and transportation. Facility types based on context. What I mean by this is you don't just put a bike lane everywhere. You look at the context of the land use of the area you're putting it in, and look at the density, look at the type of users that are going to be in those areas, and you design the facility to support that. And that's kind of the direction with multimodal transportation that we're going. With the mobility master plan, we're going to be looking at not just a bike lane anywhere, but where we put a cycle track or a multi-purpose trail, or maybe it's just a shoulder. It just depends on the area that we're looking at. A comfortable walking environment. A lot of times when I talk to cities, at least at my previous jobs, about what a walkable environment is, you'll get 100 different answers. But really what it came down to in the end was how comfortable were people feeling to actually make it feel walkable. And it's different in every community and what that means. It could be the lighting, it could be art, it could be something interesting that actually people want to make it walk. It could be just the exposure to the natural environment, so trees, plantings, bush, any type of landscaping to help support and make them feel like they're connected with their community. Eliminate parking minimums. This is a fairly controversial one, but in every community that's looked at implementing this policy, they haven't regretted it, because what you look at when you're eliminating parking minimums, you're letting the market actually drive a lot of those demands. And you'll find in a lot of cities who haven't adopted parking minimums or eliminated parking minimums in our region, but they've moved towards multimodal transportation, higher density in their downtowns, you actually see a lot of empty parking lots because you see increases in transit use. If you talk to the city of Redmond and the city of Kirkland, you'll find a lot of the developers are complaining that they were required to build too much parking in the areas of high density in their downtowns because people don't need to use the parking anymore. There's families that are moving into a lot of these areas that are fully supported by transit that don't own a car. And so that's kind of the environment that we're starting to plan for. And so that's not going to happen today, but it's one thing to consideration as we're kind of planning 20 to 30 years into the future. Mixed density. A lot of transportation choices are based on the land use, kind of the previous comment that I made. Diverse and affordable housing. I bring this up because a lot of where people live is based on the affordability of housing, and that impacts a lot of people's commutes. Part of the reason why 86% of the people who either live in Issaquah work elsewhere, or 82%, 84% of the people who work in Issaquah live elsewhere, or vice versa. Transportation demand management. Part of making the shift to multimodal transportation is about our behavior. For those who don't know transportation demand management, it's the concept behind van pools and carpooling. It's the commute trip reduction programs. It's how do you have people think about when they make a trip, they're not automatically thinking about driving their car, but they're also thinking about 3 other options to how to get to point B. People trip-based concurrency. I think you've had experience talking about concurrency and how we are how we're measuring the level of service and holding private development or developers to pay for their fair share of what goes in. People trip-based concurrency is actually looking at estimating people trips, not just vehicle trips, which is currently what our current concurrency model is based off of. That brings me to my main question. What do you have policy recommendations related to transportation that would support our mission? Kind of a big question, so please take your time. And just thinking back at this slide, is there anything specific that kind of comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, when you want to talk about eliminating parking minimums, in your example, you gave it from one side, what we've seen from developers. As somebody who has been in both of the Kirkland and Redmond communities in your example, I haven't heard a dearth of people complaining about a prolific amount of parking. So I think it's something to think about while we like to sit here and talk about a long-term future for Issaquah. We also like to talk about a lot of different players and actors and tools that we have to get there. And so the idea that developers don't like something doesn't necessarily define how we set our agendas. So I would caution kind of how we framed that discussion a little bit.
One thing I would add with that is recent studies have looked at parking requirements and that it is directly tied to the cost of housing. And so the cost of developments, and when you're adding a lot of those parking requirements, a parking stall can cost, $10,000 to $50,000. And that has actually had direct relationships to the cost of rent or the cost of mortgages for a lot of those housing units.
It does, but like you mentioned in our community, the majority of people are not able to live, work, play here. So it's a little bit confining to try to say, let's offset it here without another option, for instance.
Right.
And so I think what we have to start thinking about, similar to our situation when thinking about how we want to plan transit, is really where do we want people to put their cars? We know that people are using cars, so how do we get them out of their cars? How do we provide an area where it's easy, similar to a transit area, for people to park and get out and interact in our community rather than necessarily shutting down the availability of spaces? It's how do we use that space so that they're getting out and interacting in our community?
Right.
That's your question. Just as we spent weeks ago, we spent most of the night, or a good part of it, on the Old Town new zoning requirements, new parking requirements, and various questions came up about parking. And I'm wondering, as you develop your thought process here and reach out to the community for ideas, are you at the same time talking to the planners who are developing the new planning, the minimum requirements for Old Town, to make sure the thinking is in sync? So, for example, eliminating minimum parking requirements. How does that tie in with what we learned last week was proposed changes, some substance or not, depending on your view, in parking requirements per square foot for the Old Town area. So I'm trying to figure out how it all works within the city administration as each department goes forward thinking about their own fiefdom, if you will, their own area of specialization.
I don't know enough about what's being proposed for Old Town to fully
Don't.
answer that question, because a lot of how the planners are handling a lot of the requirement changes are based on the existing policy. And a lot of this discussion is more on what our future policy should be. And so a lot of these are examples. Not anything being proposed right now. They're just common policies that we've seen in other cities when they've talked about multimodal transportation. So I'm not familiar enough with the Old Town proposed changes to fully answer the question. I don't know if.
Yeah, I wasn't asking for a detailed answer. I was just trying to understand what level of synchronizing of thought process there is. And right now, it seems you're in one thought process mode, and we're talking Old Town. Other areas, other people are thinking about more specifics, and there's not necessarily a sitting down over lunch and saying, here's what we're doing kind of thing. Is that right?
Oh, Christopher.
Wasn't intended to be a difficult
I'm Christopher
question.
Wright with the city's Economic Development Department, and I just wanted to say, from economic development standpoint, I serve on the city's master mobility team where we review these policies and studies, and we're always looking at it from the standpoint of code amendments that are coming up that we know are happening, and so there is cross-pollination happening on those kind of internal task forces and teams that we have in the city.
Thank you.
Stephen, I know this is not an Issaquah issue. It's a King County and the entity that handles the buses. But again, we discussed a couple of times that some of the, if bus service is expanded, it would be, I think, a good idea to make all of the bus stops have shelters. We had some data, and I don't remember what it was, about people who use buses this time of year and then don't use them in the winter because they don't have a bus stop near their house that's got shelter. So, I mean, that's just an interim thing, and I understand, again, that that's not a City of Issaquah issue, but I think it's one thing that should be addressed when bus service is discussed.
I think my fear with those shelters is sometimes you see them downtown Seattle, and you see the graffiti, the trash.
That is an Issaquah issue, and that's where the police department comes in.
Yeah. The only thing I don't like about that. Stephen, for me, I'm wondering, because Issaquah, for me, is a very young city. We have a lot of young families moving in. If you look what's going on in Newport Way with all the housing there, what is the idea behind multimodal walkability? I mean, so much of our city is connected through highways. I think 35 is probably the mean or average. So walkability, are we talking about expanding sidewalks? I mean, we really don't have room. If you look at Front Street and East Sunset, I mean, there's really no more room to grow. So when you talk about walkability, I grew up in a town where the children, the teenagers are constantly on the move walking. And I know, today's youth is a little bit different with the Segways and electric bikes, but I just don't see how is that implemented in the vision that you guys are planning for.
So there's a lot of variables that kind of go into the comfortability for a walkable area. There's what are the destinations for the area? What existing facilities are there? What's the available space, kind of when you're speaking to for Front Street. There's also the use of the right-of-way. Are there buses that go? What's the speed limit on that roadway? What's the facilities for that? What are the lane widths? What are there bikes? Is there lands? So there's a lot of different things that kind of go into it. As you put more of those variables and consider detailing based on kind of the context of the area, you actually enhance a lot of the walkability further. And there's actually guidelines and guidelines behind how to make a place more walkable based on the type of area it is. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm looking at more walkable areas. And it's not going to be one size fits all. Every place is going to be a little bit different. Yes.
Speaker, when you say there are guidelines available for doing that type of design work, where do those guidelines come from? Is that an academic research background or
Yes.
government?
Congress for New Urbanism has a lot of guidelines around walkable areas. The ULI, I'm forgetting the full spelling out what ULI
Urban
stands
Land
for.
Institute.
The Urban Land Institute, thank you. They have a lot of academic research around walkable areas as well. And then there's the National Association of City Traffic Officials. They also provide really good guidance around walkability and bikeability.
Thank you.
Anything else? So where we are in the project. We're kind of in the middle. We went through the first phase developing the guiding principles, which is essentially the vision for this document. And we're moving on to the development of policies, programs, and projects. And that's where we are right now with this discussion, is talking about different types of policies that we need to be considering in the mobility master plan that would support a lot of your vision. After this phase of the project, we'll go into plan drafting. And then early next year, we'll get into plan review. And so that's when you'll be able to see the full document, or at least in draft form, and let us know if we missed anything.
From your perspective, do you have the resources you need
For
for completing the mobility master plan? We talk a lot about staff needs to be doing a lot of things a lot of times. We have to prioritize those resources as we kind of set agendas, as we make policy, as we then have that trickle down of code. From your perspective, do you guys have the resources you need?
Yes. There was a very firm budget set for developing this master plan, but as Christopher mentioned, we actually have a mobility team that is supporting me in a lot of this effort, and so I am always talking to them about how to approach different groups, how to talk to different commissions, and how to bring certain questions so that I can answer a lot of what I need for the mobility master plan development.
It's good to hear.
Are you still planning on a joint commission meeting in November with the mobility team and PPC? We put it on the schedule way back when you asked us to. It's on
With the
November
tab.
25th?
Maybe.
Maybe, okay.
It was dependent
Maybe
because
it's good.
I'm still waiting to hear back from the tab members
Okay.
on if they're going to be around that week, because it's so
okay.
close to Thanksgiving.
Okay,
So
enough.
I'm hoping to, yes,
okay,
but it's going to be dependent on everyone's availability
okay, super.
and your availability as well. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, thank you. If you need to add any further comments or questions, please feel free to email me on what's on the screen or get my contact information from Kristen.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
Good job.
Trish, are we jumping to the next topic?
Right, did you want to do audience comments first?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do
Sure.
it. Okay, so we're wrapping up the mobility master plan topic, and we're going to go ahead and open it up for public comments. Are there any public comments? Anyone?
No.
Hey, yes, go ahead. Just go ahead and state your name, please.
My name is J.J. Lin. I think the commissioner here asked the question whether or not this onset plan is working with the current parking coordinators. I don't know the exact names, but I don't think we got a real straight answer. The answer that Christopher gave, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but you said you were on the committees that potentially discussed this, but you guys are looking, in the future to change parking in the code, and so maybe there could be a definite yes or no. I mean, I don't know if, it doesn't sound like Stephen, who gave the presentation initially, was talking to the parking people who are changing the code there. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment, please? I see no other public comment. We'll go ahead and close the public comments. And we will go ahead and go on to Kristen with proposed Old Town Code amendments.
Actually going to let Christopher do much of this because we brought him here to answer some questions that came up last time. But as a reminder, these came up because we discussed these proposed amendments. And the numbers, I realize it starts with 2 and ends with 15, and there are only 6 up here, but I'm trying to stay consistent with the action items that are in the plan so that we don't get confused as we're going through, so that's why. So we worked on these action items, which were code revisions to reduce heights in the cultural and business district, multifamily high zoning district, and the single-family duplex district. Revisions to increase impervious surface in the cultural and business district to 95%, and multifamily high from 50 to 75%. To require ground floor commercial on Front Street, when you face Front Street. Revisions to allow small-scale standalone retail and multifamily high just on East Sunset Way. Remove Old Town parcels as transfer of development rights receiving sites, which are in multifamily high, CBD, and multifamily medium. And then develop incentives that reduce parking requirements for neighborhood-oriented businesses by 10%. So we had that discussion last time. Those amendments are in your packet, and if we need to, we can pull those up as well. But when we were having that conversation, several questions were raised. So we sent these questions out the Tuesday after the meeting to make sure that we had hit the right ones and asked if you all had any more questions, and we didn't hear anything. So this is what we're going to cover tonight. Other things may come up, but this is our planned discussion for now. I think that's it. And now I'm going to have Christopher Wright talk. He can address all of these.
Hello, Planning Policy Commission. Thank you for having me. Randy, it's especially great to see you. I think you and I both are probably having some wicked flashbacks right now to your Development Commission years, but we'll try to get past that. So I'll answer the kind of the business-related questions first, and then I'll jump into kind of the parking study overview. The first question you had to do with do businesses or the Downtown Issaquah Association know how much of their business is local from Old Town versus how much is regional from outside of Old Town. It's kind of a oddly specific question that I'm going to give a very general, broad answer to. There are ways to track, of course, through credit card purchases, where the zip codes are from, but it won't get you as close as neighborhoods. So, but about as close as I can get to answering that question, I know I talked to Beth Javins, who is the executive director of Visit Issaquah, and she has been recently surveying the city and the community, asking a similar question, but from the completely opposite standpoint, from the point of she's interested in finding out what kind of businesses and activities and events draw people regionally to Issaquah, right? Because she's interested in the Visit Issaquah destination marketing standpoint. But from some of those surveys, again, this is not scientific and not even published yet, but in talking about this question, what she said, what she has been finding is about the responders to the business respondents to the surveys have said about half of their customers are from Issaquah and half are from outside of Issaquah. Again, very general, but just to give you an idea, and I do think that as unscientific as that is, just knowing what I know and having seen what I see, that sounds about right to me, actually. Obviously, in Old Town specifically, you'll get a different answer if you asked Art by Fire. The percentage of their people customers are local versus a hair salon would be different versus Jack's would be different. But like I said, to give you an idea, on average, maybe half. Does the Economic Development Department do exit interviews when business leaves? That was a great question. When I was watching the meeting, I thought that was a great question, a great idea. I would say not exactly. I will tell you what we do. I mean, eventually we do hear, either indirectly or directly why businesses have left. But we don't sit down and do a formal interview with them. But again, I think it's a great idea. What we do is every year we do what we call BRE visits, which are business retention and expansion visits. And the Economic Development Department has a goal of doing about 60 of those a year. As economic developer, you know that it is easier and more efficient and cost-effective to work with existing businesses that are in your city to help them grow and thrive and expand. It's easier to put your energy at that than trying to attract new businesses into your city. And so that's one of the things that we do. Again, through these BRE visits, when we're sitting down with the businesses, we're going through a questionnaire, touching base with them on how is their business doing? Is business increasing? Is it getting worse? What's great about doing business in Issaquah? What's not so great about doing business in Issaquah? What are your challenges? How have your interactions with the city been? So we use those visits to really kind of take the temperature of the business community. So the goal there is to try and catch them before they get to the point that they're exiting. But that's one of the ways that we kind of keep tabs on how things are going out there. How do business owners feel about neighborhood-oriented businesses coming into the area? So the businesses in Old Town, downtown, they want exactly the same thing that we want, that you all want, which is to have active, thriving, engaging business fronts with a lot of people going in and out, basically. And we want those businesses to just have a lot of activity and be successful. And so a business that meets the definition of a neighborhood-oriented business, again, if you look at it, it talks about meeting the daily needs. And we could talk about whether that's the right term or not. But basically, if you meet that definition of a neighborhood-oriented business, it is going to be a very active business with a lot of people going in and out of it. And so, yes, if you're a business owner, that's what you want around you. And then if it's a neighborhood business, which also implies that more people are able to walk or bike there, then they're not taking up more parking, then that's an even bigger bonus to have next to you. So yes, businesses are supportive of neighborhood-oriented businesses downtown. What are businesses' thoughts on required ground floor commercial on Front Street? I wanted to point out here that a distinction often needs to be made between what the businesses would prefer and what the property owners would prefer. I know it's real easy, in your discussions, especially what do the businesses think about that? What do the businesses think about this? But it is also important to keep in mind what do the property owners think, because they're not the same, downtown. And sometimes in some issues, they don't think the same. And for the property owners, if you're requiring ground floor commercial, when you start to reduce the pool of people that can either rent or buy your place, usually you may not be supportive of that. Whereas the businesses would absolutely, they would rather have next to them an active commercial business than a residential use that is, dead and quiet all day. But having said that, Front Street, requiring ground floor commercial, even the property owners, of course, it just makes sense. And, because the property owners also want to have highest and best use as well. And certainly on Front Street, when you're up against the sidewalk, commercial use is going to be the highest and best use there as opposed to residential. So those are some answers to the business questions, and then I can talk a little bit about the parking study too. I can go on. So again, I watched the meeting, I saw a lot of your questions that came up, and I'll try to answer those, and then if you have more, certainly I'm here to answer them. So the parking study was done, like the inventory that I'm going to talk about was done about exactly a year ago. There was 2 days in August of last year and then 2 days in September of last year. We did weekdays, weekends, before school started, after school was in session, whether there's village theater shows or not. We did a variety of times to try to capture typical days. And I know one of the things that you were asking about was how many parking stalls are we talking about? When we talk about in the CBD, how many parking stalls are there? This map shows the area that we used for the parking study in Old Town, which goes from basically Northwest Holly Street to the north, down to around the community center to the south. And it's roughly the CBD zone, but also includes a lot of the community facilities around City Hall and everything. Again, we looked at public parking and not the private parking lots. And of all of that area, there are about 750 public parking stalls. And the inventory was done, like I said, there was four different days from like 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., maybe later. Every hour, they would hit each parking spot to see whether it's utilized or not. And what they found is the absolute peak of those 4 days, of those 50 hours or so that they were tracking parking downtown, the very peak was on Saturday, September 22nd from 1 to 2 p.m., and that's what's shown here. And I think you can read, in red is where the parking utilization is 85% or above. In yellow is where the parking occupancy was between 60 and 85%. And then in green is where the parking occupancy was less than 60%. And so at that peak time, in that whole area, in that whole beige area, 62% of the parking stalls were occupied. And more typically during the peak times we found in the city, it was around 60% of all of the parking stalls in that area being occupied, which means about 285 available stalls, again, at any given time during the peak. Now, clearly, it's important to look at the area, because if you just looked at the core around the depot, you would say, wow, obviously we're at 85% or above, there's a problem. Because that 85% number is kind of the magic number when talking about parking management. If it's more than 85% implies that if you're driving around, that on a particular block, there may be 1 or 2 spaces available. It takes some looking, but they're there. If it's much more than 85%, then there's a lot of trouble. You're having trouble finding it. And so at 85% is when you start to implement management practices, typically. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But you have to look, again, you have to look at the area that's surveyed, and then the other significant piece of that is how far people are willing to walk when they do park to their destination. And we did an online survey, and the respondents, more than 70% said that it was reasonable to walk 3 to 5 minutes to your destination. And about 10% were neutral on that. So, it was a pretty significant number that thought it was acceptable to walk that far. And so, certainly, we found in this area that at any given time, there is plenty of available parking within a 3 to 5 minute walk. So that was the finding. So then the next question is, what are their next steps? And when approaching parking management, there's kind of 4 different steps or options you go through. The first one is continue to monitor, which is the direction we're going. So I'll get back to that in just a minute. The second thing that you do, again, when you're at 85%, for either a bigger area of what I showed or for longer periods of time, when you really do need to start doing something, usually the first thing you would do is put time limits on it. But time limits, that is not just putting up signs, because there's enforcement involved. You can't just put the signs up, you also have to enforce. So there's some cost associated with that. After putting time limits, the next step would usually be parking meters or having paid parking. That's kind of the next level up of parking management. Again, there's a lot of enforcement involved in that. There's the equipment, there's court costs. We looked at all of the implications of doing these. And then finally, the fourth thing is to basically build a parking garage or create more parking. Those are kind of the steps you go through to address parking. Again, like I said, having seen that at any given time, there's, we're at about 60% utilization within that area. What we recommended and what the city council agreed was basically the continuing to monitor and low-cost alternative, which is basically involves education, outreach, and signage. And so what we're doing is we've committed to every couple of years doing that survey again, because downtown obviously is dynamic. I mean, ironically, what we found this past year was pretty similar to a parking study that was done in 2012. As far as where the highest utilization is and about, parking has increased a little bit downtown, but there hasn't been significant changes since 2012. But having said that, knowing that we're continuing to tweak our regulations and, developments, new businesses come in and hopefully even are booming even more than they are today, we need to continue to monitor that. So not in 2020, but in 2021, we'll go back and do that inventory again. It's real important to do the same, maybe even the same days, but for sure the same block fronts, same time periods, just so we can compare apples to apples to see how much is changing. So continuing to monitor is one thing we'll do. Update and share new parking maps. This is kind of the education and outreach piece. This is a parking map that we've been working on updating that we can post on the Downtown Issaquah Association website, the city website, give out to businesses to hand out again to inform the public, show them where all of the available public parking is. Again, that's an example of kind of the education piece. Wayfinding signage. So the city is going through the process right now of hiring a consultant to focus on wayfinding. We know that parking downtown is going to be a piece of that. Better signage to direct people to where the available parking is, and just kind of a consistent plan so that it doesn't get lost in all the other signs. So improving signage to direct people to and from parking is one of the things that should be part of that wayfinding plan that the city is just starting. Explore additional shared parking opportunities. Mostly that is focused on more efficiently using the parking that already exists today. And probably about the best example of that would be, there are businesses downtown that are only open during the day and closed at night, but they still have signs up that say customer parking only, not open to the public. So we're talking to businesses. Some of them are more receptive than others as far as opening it up to the public at night. And so we may have to follow that up with some additional signage or having them take down signs or put new ones up. And so that's what that piece means, is again, better utilizing what's downtown already. And then focusing on the pedestrian experience. I added that because it's kind of an important piece. If we're asking customers to walk and park more around the periphery of town and walk to their destination, we obviously want to make sure that that walk is as safe and clear and well-lit and pleasant as it possibly can be. And so where that plays out is in a lot of other things that the city is always working on, if they're replacing the street lights downtown. Or I know the one thing that comes to mind is the Parks Department is going to be looking at the Veterans Memorial Field Master Plan this next year. And I know, if we're going to ask people to park around, because there's a lot of parking around Memorial Field, but if we're going to ask people to start utilizing that parking more, we want to make sure that there's just, a clear, easy way to get from Front Street to where that parking is. And it's not real easy, you know, there's there's train tracks and everything there, but kind of one of the quicker and easier solutions is making sure that those walkways are pleasant to be on, so that people don't mind that walk. I think that's everything that I had prepared to say, but I'm certainly open to any questions you may have.
We're going to go with the public
Good.
first, or what?
Yeah, let's go ahead and, actually, I like that idea. Let's go ahead and open that up to public comments. Any public comments? Good.
Thank you, JJ Lin. I'm a property owner on Front Street here. So one of the things that I brought up at the last meeting was, you know, in my opinion, and the reason I say this is because I'm looking to develop my property, the code changes that are going to occur are essentially a down zone. And I understand from a public policy standpoint, maybe that's the direction that you want to take Old Town. But my question, and what I would like to challenge the commission to do, is ask the question on what do they think it's going to do to property values in the Old Town area. And I don't think that's been answered, or at least I haven't heard it from the couple of the planning commission meetings that I've been to. And, you know, maybe I missed them and maybe it was already done. But I think in the packets that we've gotten and that you've gotten, that hasn't been addressed. And if you want to move ahead with these proposed changes, I think it's fine, but we're going to be going into public commenting soon. And I think the commission should be prepared for questions about property values and how it's going to affect it. Because the way I see it, a lot of Front Street is built out already. And so you can say, well, you know, these changes aren't going to affect, you know, lowering the building heights aren't going to affect, you know, the existing buildings. And, you know, maybe on the surface, that might be true. But in my mind, and this is my opinion, your property value is composed of two things: land value and building value. So if you are on Front Street and you're in the Old Town area in the center and you've already been built, well, the only thing that can really go up in value is your land, because you have an existing building. And maybe that'll go up because you maintain it for inflation. But, you know, if you look at your little property value stickers that you, the things that they mail, it's land and building. And so in my mind, if you essentially downzone, you've given more, you know, usable area for your land in exchange for reducing building height, but in my mind, it's still a down zone. And so I feel like that's going to reduce the land value of the existing buildings, existing property. And I'm not asking you to take my word for it. What I'm challenging you as a commission is find the answer. Has anyone asked the question? And if it has, I haven't seen it presented. And, you know, these packets are pretty large, and so I'm not saying I read every single line on it, but I think that's a reasonable question from the public to ask. And, you know, it's true, I'm a property owner on Front Street, but that's what I'm asking. And I'm not trying to ask you to take my word for it. I'm saying, well, who's asked the question? And in my mind, we haven't heard that. And the last thing I wanted to address was requiring retail on Front Street. As Christopher mentioned already, well, if you're a property developer, you're going to try to maximize the highest value you could use for your property. And I have a piece of property at the very end of Front Street, and sure, if I look at the economics, I'd probably want to do retail. But what I take exception to is that why are we writing it into the code to require property owners to do that? I mean, what is the rationale? If it's going to be the best use for my property, well, I think that the Planning Commission and the city should let property owners decide what's the best use for the property. I think, you know, if you want to change the building heights and, you know, the pervious surface, I mean, I think those are all reasonable things we as property owners can take. But I don't think we need to dictate how property owners do things. And, you should just let the economics take care of themselves. And I wouldn't presume to, tell you, you have to build a parking garage on, your single residence house or whatever. I mean, I don't, so this is why, just from a principal perspective, I have a lot of problem. And I would want the commission to, ask the city to reconsider that portion of the code amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? No more public comment? Okay, being I see no more public comment, I'll go ahead and close public comments. Right now?
Do you have any questions?
Well, one of the great opportunities that we have in this forum is for the public to ask questions. And so would the city like to address the questions that were just asked? Specifically regarding, Christopher, if you want to address how you feel property values are going to be affected by the changes that we want to put forward?
Sure. I know that with every code amendment and every policy that you look at, there's implications that it's going to affect property values, right? Whether they're critical areas regulations or, setback impervious calculations, whether it's signage, everything potentially can impact property values. I do know that it's when we've received appeals or when you hear about cases that are challenging that, it is hard to prove that it's negatively affecting your property values. Again, this is a little out of my area of expertise. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I know when the hearing examiner has heard similar arguments, having to prove that it's negatively affecting your property values can be difficult. Having said that, I know take the height, for example, the limitations. Businesses downtown have been able, properties downtown have been able to build up to 65 feet for a really long time, since the 90s at least. And nobody's really taken advantage of that. There's a lot of reasons for that. Most of it has to do with as you saw in some of the other code amendments, if you're expanding that, you're building more than 10%, you need to start to meet parking requirements. All of the properties downtown are really small. And so when you start to need to add parking because you're building a bigger building, it just doesn't work. And so I think that's why, even though it's been allowed for a long time, we haven't seen a bunch of people coming in with tall, skinny buildings because you need to provide the parking.
May I step in for a second, Christopher?
Bet.
So on the non-economic or technical side of things, in the 4 open houses, 470 plus responses that we got, 12 public meetings between PPC and City Council. What we kept hearing too is that the value for the people who live in Old Town and for a lot of Issaquah residents is the character of Old Town. So it's not necessarily, they look at something new that may go in next to them and go, oh my gosh, it's 3 feet. It's 3 stories high or 4 stories high, and I've got 17 windows looking into my backyard. That reduces my property value simply in that nobody wants to have 17 windows looking into their backyard. So it's a different way of looking at it, but that's what we heard in the 1.5 years that we did the plan. And that's one of the ways that we're looking at trying to preserve the character of Old Town.
Yeah, thank you. That was another point I wanted to make, that we as a community are deciding that maintaining the character of Old Town is the thing that we want to do, and that in turn will help businesses continue to grow and thrive because of its unique, special character.
Christopher, this may be just a semantic issue, but I believe the documents that we've been looking at up to now on the point of code revisions to require ground floor commercial on Front Street, I believe that the word that was used prior to this was retail on Front Street, not commercial on Front Street. So I may be wrong, but when I was reading this again and again after the last meeting, and I sent a question in to Trish about clarification of, can the city show, my specific question was, can the city show where requiring retail has worked? But if it's not retail. If it's commercial, which I assume would be in that big list of businesses, it could be a law office or an insurance office, as there is on there now, then it's a little bit less of a concern to me, but still requiring the kind of business is I don't know. It's
Right. So I'll let Kristen talk in just a minute, because we have done a little bit of talking to other cities that have similar requirements. But I know exactly what you're saying. I thought the same thing when I read it. Do we want to continue to allow offices, as a storefront, or do we really want it to be retail? I think that's a question for you to talk about. I think in one of the other cities, they use the term active commercial, which I like that as a kind of a general guideline that wouldn't necessarily exclude all offices, but, just not ones that maybe corporate offices that just deal with business elsewhere and not locally. So there is a difference between saying commercial and retail, and we have been talking about that. But I think it's worth exploring. But I think the best compromise between what it will be acceptable to, and not too limiting to the property owners, a good compromise is that active commercial definition.
okay, can you define an I'm not trying to sharpshoot here.
Yeah,
but
no,
what
I
is
know.
an inactive commercial?
Again, inactive commercial would be businesses that serve more regional customers, that don't have people coming in and out. A development firm, for example.
Well, what about an example of like an insurance agent? We have an insurance agent on Front Street,
There
right?
are some, right, and there are some examples in town. I mean, there's two
No,
pieces.
but I think our question is, can you classify, is that an active commercial space? It's certainly not retail. How does the
Right,
city?
so Kirkland looks at it, when they look at it, they say there's high customer turnover. So, I think, yes, we would have to do some research into what exactly that means, but not that somebody comes in once a day or twice a day, but more people are kind of on a regular basis going in and out.
I would think like the T-Mobile corporate office, where the only people that are going into those buildings are T-Mobile employees.
Right.
That's not true. You have
that's kind of the-
vendors, you have people from around the country coming in. I mean, like, there's
But not
actually broader
necessarily
definitions.
Issaquah residents, not local.
No, but again, that's a broader definition of who's coming and going and the business that they're bringing in from around the country. How do we quantify
So
people
this
who are coming in and using hotel space? I mean, there's a broader implication than just necessarily who is coming in and out of the front door.
How about the construction builder that bought that little house on Front Street? So there's a
Right,
little house that has the solar panels on there?
I'm not familiar with it, but I would consider that to not be a high turnover.
I wouldn't think it's a high
And
turnover.
again,
It's an
it's just-
office. I think
yeah.
that would, if you continue down this road to allow commercial, then that would be an acceptable use. If you wanted to go push it a little bit further and only allow retail, then that would not be an allowed use.
So do we have a fixed list right now? of
We
What
do.
would be allowed for retail?
We do, because, not for
right-
retail,
right
because
now it
right now
says-
we're allowing commercial and retail.
Okay, so so do we like the terminology act? Can we use that term moving
We
forward?
can, I think,
Okay.
we just heard it today for the first time.
I like it.
And we'd need to it would need some boundaries
Yes.
on it. So we need to figure a definition.
Can we ask for that from the next time
Absolutely.
that we see this?
Sure.
To actually be able to see where this lies, what is our, permitted and not permitted uses kind of a thing?
Sure.
And Mr. Chair, it might be helpful here to get a consensus of the PPC as to whether or not, very clearly, there should be a restriction, or, I'm sorry, a requirement. I think that's the issue that we're talking about here. Should the city, as a matter of policy, require retail or a specific type of activity in Old Town on Front Street?
Point of order, Mr.
one-
Chairman. We are not deciding anything as a commission
No,
tonight.
I'm just
So
trying to,
I
I'm
would
just trying
not-
to see if there is a consensus, and if there isn't, then, then we'll save staff time from.
Well, this eventually gets to city council, right? For
Yeah,
any changes, our
Yeah.
job is to engage the public, figure out how people are thinking about it. We're not going to come up with a decision on whether the city moves forward or not. What we're here to do is kind of help the city come up with a great case that makes sense, right? So.
And right now, we don't, it's not clear to us.
So-
right? That's what I'm saying. Is it?
No, I think we have some more work to do on it.
Well, we've done a little. If you guys will give me just a second. So we just got your email on Tuesday, so it's not a whole lot of time to do research. But I did talk to MRSC, who sent me, which is the Municipal Resource Service, something like that. It's a regional association that helps planners do research. They didn't, there were some articles that they sent. And I will say, and some of it's kind of hard to see. Some of it's bigger cities, some of it's smaller cities, and that's kind of depends. That's a factor in it. I did talk to Redmond and Kirkland. It's Redmond. Redmond does not allow, it's kind of funny, Redmond in certain areas does not allow parking or residential to face their frontage on certain streets, which means essentially that leaves it open that you can only put commercial uses there. And it did take a long time for that to kick in, but they've seen it be very effective. And over the past 10 years or so, what it took for them was for the residential community to come in, because you can't have commercial succeed unless you have the residential there, which they didn't have. And Old Town does have it. I also talked to Kirkland. Kirkland also has a very similar thing. We say, you have to have 20 feet of space. They say you have to have 30 feet of space of active commercial. And theirs has been very successful. And again, it's only in small areas. You can't apply it over a large area. And Redmond did do that. They applied it over their whole downtown for a while, and it didn't work, so they reduced it and applied it to intersections and certain streets, which is kind of what we're trying here. And again, Kirkland relies on that. They already have a lot of residential around it, but the apartments that have gone in have helped as well. But they've seen successes, and the Kirkland director came from the Bay Area, and he said he would need some time, but he knows that several Bay Area smaller cities require this kind of thing on the ground levels, and they've been successful, but he said it's not enough time. He'd have to help me research.
Okay.
So I think based on what I'm hearing, there seems to be a lot of passion behind this, maybe presenting or asking the city staff, bring us some aspirations or some ideas before the next time we have a discussion on the Old Town Code amendments about what might be some benefits to having retail only on maybe certain segments, what it might look like with having active commercial, and what other organizations might be, how they have their downtown set up, whether or not it would be an appropriate fix for us.
I think that's great. I just, the biggest question for me is the change in the wording. I mean, does the city, is it retail or is it active commercial? That I would have.
Right, and that's gone back and forth. They will say the task force, when they first made their recommendations, they referred to retail. When it made it into the Old Town plan, it became commercial. And then when we had longer discussions about it, when we were doing the code amendments, we said, well, let's look at both and do commercial and retail. So if you all have a preference, and I think Christopher pointed out one time that the more open you leave it, property owners may be a little happier with that. It gives them more options as to who they can lease to. But you also want to make sure that it does have a lot of customers coming in and out, or interaction with the street.
I think around that, there is definitely some discussion that probably needs to happen, because we all need to be educated on what those options look like, and we're not prepared to have those discussions today because we don't know what those options may be. So maybe having staff come up with, hey, here's some proposed solutions, here's some aspirations, here's what people think, and allow us to be able to take it to the next step.
Can you remind me the decisions that we made on the future of Mall Street off of Gilman when we talked about creating that retail ground floor space? If the language was, again, retail, or if we think that this concept is evolving citywide to include even CBD of being an active commercial.
Do you mean the vertical mixed use?
Yeah, we talked about requiring a retail component over, wasn't it called Mall Street? Basically, we were creating,
A little bit over, but
Yeah.
But
over
that
by
was part
Raleigh.
of the moratorium, the vertical mixed-use requirements. These are different in that Central is going to be, in the future, hopefully very different than Old Town is. And so with Old Town, the way it's written now in your packet, the code amendment says commercial/retail. So it's sort of open-ended. We don't say active commercial. It's just commercial/retail. So that's the whole list of uses that we had on the screen 2 weeks ago of all of the ones that are proposed that they can do now on Front Street that they would be able to do as that first floor. So it was a whole screen full of uses that they could use to fill that requirement.
So my question is when we talk a lot about terminology, setting a definition of terms as we move forward to help people navigate code in the city, are we adopting a citywide concept that is active commercial versus retail and a definition of what these categories are?
Right. Tonight's the first night we've ever said active commercial. The way it's written is commercial, like the zoning code thinks of commercial, which would be the list of uses that were on the screen 2 weeks ago. But if you would like us to ponder an active commercial definition, we could go back to our desks and do some research on how do other communities define that and use that, if that's something that all of you would want us to do. If it's only, two of you, then, but, I agree with Randy, it would be good to see sort of what the flavor is of the commission so that, Kristen and I aren't doing work that's only narrowly focused. But we're happy to do that if the commission is curious and interested in pursuing an active commercial definition.
What my question was in regards to the work we've previously done regarding on the future of Mall Street. Was that specifically a retail component below, or was it a commercial? Is it commercial/retail?
It's called vertical mixed use, and I believe it was commercial on the bottom floor.
Commercial on the bottom floor. Thank you. That's what
But then again, that's Central, so their terminology is different than Old Town because it's still a different code.
I know, yeah.
Christopher, again, not Old Town, but some of the apartment, I believe actually all of the apartment complexes that have gone in the Central District, when the applicant came, I believe we told them that we wanted retail on the bottom floor. And as I recall, at least one for sure, one of the newer apartment buildings, the agreement was that they would make the ground floor compatible with
So that it could be
future use.
converted later.
If somebody wanted to come in, but one of the questions that I had is, to the best of my knowledge, there have been no commercial/retail businesses that have approached the apartments, the newer apartments that have the ability to accommodate them, but there's been no demand. Is that correct, as far as you know?
That's correct. I haven't heard of those complexes being approached by businesses wanting to move in there either.
And that was my concern about requiring this on Front
Right.
Street.
But the other side of that story, though, Randy, is when they first came in to talk to us about their site, we asked them if they would provide retail or commercial services on the bottom floor, and they said we would, but it's not required. And we said, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Well,
And they said, we could, but we're not going to because it's not required.
So what I think is they can,
They
but they
can.
haven't. So I think that's why we said we'd really like to see retail there when we approved the
Right.
projects.
Right. And so I think when this came up for Old Town, we thought, maybe we should try requiring it just to be sure that we get what we think we want in the future and not all of a sudden have a storefront that's really something that's not active and not helping the street and not helping the area, and we'll have that for how many years until it turns over.
So do we want to take a tally on questions we want to pose to the staff for the next time we have a discussion on Old Town amendments? Any questions that people would like to hear? And if you have a question, we can take a quick tally and see if it's something we want to follow up with.
I was quite vociferous about this last meeting, that I think we've opened up a can of worms here, that introducing the word required in here is rather than incentivize or some other ameliorating word that's just asking for problems. Trying to introduce a concept like active commercial that then depends on the operator. I bring in an active commercial tenant that may comport with the new regulation if you adopted it, but I'm a lousy operator and I generate no traffic and I go belly up. So to me, I certainly would like to have this tally and see if we're wanting to ask more questions, because I think we're just asking for trouble. And just a comment to you, by the way, I used to be a developer for most of my life, and here in Canada. And if I come to you as city official and you ask me, would you provide retail? And I've had this happen. If I can say to you something that induces you to smile sweetly at me and think well of me, I will say it. Particularly if I know it's not required. Developers are salesmen. So if you extrapolated from that comment something that is now actionable, it's led you to think something, then I'm just suggesting to you that there's maybe some other undercurrent there that, most developers will say, yes, we will, especially if they know they don't have to. So, and most of the ones I know have talked to over the years, including myself, who said, it just doesn't pencil. So we can look at it and ask for it all I want, but I'm just telling you as a practitioner, spent most of my life in this business, it just doesn't pencil when you start making requirements in a dynamic environment. So I would certainly like to have a tally, and I think we're barking up the wrong tree here with the word requirement.
Point of clarification, we're not talking about policy, though. We're talking about clarification, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about questions that
Questions we are posing to city staff to discuss in the next time we have a discussion about proposed Old Town amendments. So we're not actually making any decisions tonight about anything. We're just saying these are questions that we want to have clarification to during our next conversation. It sounds like there might be one around what would be the definition of active commercial?
What would that look like?
Yeah, what is the list? How does that compare to retail?
And then one thing I remember we did with, I believe you guys showed us pictures of some firehouses and things like that, is describe, what does Kirkland do by the waterfront? They have a very successful retail area down there at the very end of 85th Street that goes down by their cabana, where they have basically their Kirkland Days. And that's been very successful, and that's mixed with a lot of residential and multifamily used homes and things like that, apartments and condos. And then again, to Christine's point, why did Redmond fail? What is it about Redmond that did not work?
Oh, they adjusted. It didn't fail.
Sure,
They
but
adjusted the scope, and now it's succeeding.
Now it's
Now that
succeeding.
they've been able to build out the residential component and
Okay.
narrow the scope.
so what does that look like? And what is Redmond doing differently than, say, Kirkland? And cities that are somewhat similar to Issaquah. And then to my mind, like I said, I think Kirkland in that particular area is kind of like the twin sister city, so to speak, of Old Town. So maybe something like that.
Okay.
So is it more than just two that are interested in that, or? Three, okay.
We'll take a tally. Those that are in favor of that kind of question, raise your hand.
Super.
Okay. I also had in my notes to sort of do a pros and cons for requiring it. So one is active commercial. What does that look like? How would you define it? Where are the boundaries? And then the other one is pros and cons. And then what do other cities can do? And why did they succeed and fail? So does that cover it? Okay.
I'd like to make a comment, Chris, to you about this Old Town parking study. I find it a little funny that there's the concept that we have a plethora of spaces, and what that really means is I love this map, because this is really the question of what the commission was asking last week, and I think was kind of missing when I was reading the packet, was that in order to say that we have a dearth of spaces is to say that you need to park by Gilman to be able to go to Sunset. And while in theory, I think we would all say that a 5-minute walk is not that big a deal, I know I personally have planned to go into Old Town, been in my car, can't find a space, and I go to another city because it's raining. And to me, I'm just not going to go and park past the dairy to then come and walk back in the dark back in my car. So I think while it's all well and good to think about it in terms of this big space, the map that you provided for, that was actually the educational map, doesn't include parking way up by Gilman and Front Street. So it's kind of funny because you have this mismatch of being like, we have all this parking, but we're not even providing the parking options of saying, you need to walk your ass all the way down past the dairy, especially when we don't have this contiguous retail presence where there is things for people to be doing constantly. You know, I personally don't frequent the reading room, and so it's not a stop that I make on the way as I'm walking past the dairy to come all the way down to where we have our kind of congested area of restaurants. I think it's a little silly to compare it to Seattle because when saying, well, I'm going to park and I'm going to walk, my options are different in Seattle. I have a much wider variety and diversity. The scale of what I'm getting is also not the same. So as someone who really enjoys going to Seattle and is a city-centric person, I'm willing to do that because I'm getting something for it. If I'm coming into Issaquah, then I'm also wanting to get a different experience. So you have these trade-offs of saying, I don't mind dealing with the pros and cons of a city because I'm getting something for it, just like when I come to Issaquah, I want to have a certain experience. So I would encourage you to look at and see, we do have a lot of red spaces, and they are exactly where we have a lot of our peak businesses. And so how do we want to encourage people to be able to come and get out of their cars and really engage with our community rather than this kind of arbitrary number of saying, well, we do have a lot of spaces, but if those spaces aren't getting used, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have them, is all I would like to point out.
And actually, to Joy's point, if a lot of these businesses have no parking because it is their private, and you have another business that is impacted by that because they don't have enough parking for them, is the study calculating the empty spaces for the stores that have empty parking spaces, which is only for them because no one's in their store, versus, does that make sense?
Just for public, right?
Kind of, but to reiterate, we were only looking at public parking. In other words, parking that's on the street, and then the public parking that's kind of around the depot and around the community center. We weren't looking at the private parking lots. We weren't looking at all of the parking on First Place behind Las Margaritas and Edward Jones. You know, we weren't looking at the private lots. We were only looking at the public parking.
Thank you for the clarification.
Christopher, could we get a copy of the questionnaire used for the BRE? Could we just see it?
Oh, sure.
Could we do that?
Yeah.
And this is kind of tangential, and it's my last question. Is the city still working to move City Hall north, to consolidate in an Old Town? Is that still a dream?
I sure hope so. I mean, I hope they're working on it. The answer is yes, and I know that it's an issue that when our new city administrator comes on board is going to be one of his big issues.
Roughly how many employees are still down by Lowe's?
At City Hall Northwest, where our office is?
Yeah.
What would you say?
Ballpark.
75?
Oh, no, more than that, more than that.
But it's not just City Hall Northwest. The Parks Department's spread out all over.
Yeah.
Public Works is spread out all over.
Yeah.
So.
But that would be the point is, when that gets done, that would be a significant increase in the people who are doing business downtown.
Exactly. Yep.
And parking.
Could you, terminology, there's a direct parking implication to having I can't remember the word, it's a locally oriented business.
Neighborhood
oriented
Is that
business.
right? Can you described coming at it from the economic development perspective and saying, looking from the out in, as a process of enforcement or a question of enforcement, how is it going to be determined whether a business is a locally oriented business, which in turn drives the parking requirements, amongst other things, for that business. Can you describe how you're going to make the determination on an ongoing basis, not just initially with a list maybe, but ongoing and monitoring? How is that working?
Well, this concept of a neighborhood business is not one that's in the code right now. It's part of the code amendments. And there's a definition then of what a neighborhood-oriented business is. And that's one of the things that you'll be voting on. And so really, and I'll read the wording to you because it is important.
Well, it's a business that has 10 or fewer locations around the United States and serves the daily needs of the community.
The community being what?
In this case, Old Town.
Old Town, yeah.
So I have 9 businesses around the United States, and I serve Redmond, and I serve Kirkland, and I certainly serve Issaquah. I'm just making up a story here. That is not a locally oriented business?
It's not called local, it's called neighborhood-oriented business.
Neighborhood.
So the intent is that, no, if you have 10 or fewer, then that would be considered a neighborhood-oriented business.
Right.
So Starbucks would not be considered a neighborhood-oriented business because they have thousands.
Right, and the point is not to say we only want that kind. The point is there a way that we can bring in those sorts of businesses for the residents of Old Town and the business people of Old Town to allow them to have a small parking reduction in order to get that business to be here. It doesn't affect anybody that's already here. It's only if you're a property owner and you have a choice of, I could have a Starbucks or I could have a really cool little niche kind of a business that would serve daily needs. It might be a restaurant, it might be a hardware store, it might be but then you would get a parking break if you brought in the niche hardware store, let's say, versus if you chose to bring in a Starbucks or a Tully's or they're not around anymore, but something that's not a neighborhood business. So it's not that we're saying that's all we want. It's a way to bring in those businesses with a small parking reduction, because a lot of the people here that either work here or live here would be able to walk, and so it wouldn't need quite so many parking spaces. That's the only reason that we're doing that. It's not at all to say or to send a message that that's all we want here. It's just another option for another sort of business that we're hoping to have here.
It's a tool to incentivize.
Yes, perfect. It's
As a good example, like maybe wanting to have a local brewery versus a national chain of couch manufacturer.
Right. And it's not just to bring those people here, but it's also to help those businesses, because as Stephen said, a parking space can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000. So if these businesses are trying to get started and they can't because they have to add 3 parking spaces that are going to cost them $60,000 total, then maybe this is a way to help them out and help them build their business.
So can you describe that? I guess I hear you, but I'm a property owner, and I bring in a coffee shop that's locally, a single coffee shop. It's extremely expensive, and now I want to franchise it. And I franchise it across Washington State, let's say, to make argument, and now I've got 11. What happens to my parking requirements?
You're already here.
If you're already here. Thank you, Joy. We're going to hire you.
You're
already here.
grandfathered in. That means that you're grandfathered in.
Yeah.
I think officially it might be considered a non-conforming use.
Yes.
So you'd
but that
better
gets a
not
little
leave
complicated.
and want to come back, or else you're going to have some obligations to the community.
And what would the benefit be to the community of having a successful locally owned coffee shop as opposed to a Starbucks? I'm still not clear on that from an economic, from a people turnover point of view. What is it, to try and drive local entrepreneurship and give them a leg? Is that
give them a chance.
From a citizen of the city,
that right?
it will prevent Old Town from turning into a strip of corporate stores.
Okay.
And this hard work will also keep Old Town Front Street from turning into a bunch of condos.
Because you can
It maintains the look and feel of the city.
Yeah, you can come into Issaquah and do business in a lot of places. What we want to do is protect Old Town.
And it's the shop local concept, right? The money that we spend in Issaquah, if it's a local business, will stay in Issaquah as opposed to going to, Tucson or corporate headquarters somewhere.
I think based on what I'm hearing from my commissioners and the city staff, what I value about Old Town is a vibrancy. And you get that when you have people, and people like retail and diners and coffee shops. And I think if we lose that to a commercial office, then our Old Town isn't going to be as vibrant as we need it to be, because that vibrancy is going to support all the other businesses that are on that floor. So if we have the ground floor retail requirement, I think that would be probably a good thing, and then have, you know, your commercial above, or if you want condominiums above or apartments above. What I'm hearing back and forth is, my only concern is that I don't want to lose the vibrancy of Front Street by allowing too many different options, and that's just a comment. But
Can I'm hearing a lot of different terminology going around, and the way that we're talking about this particular provision, it's a small piece of the Old Town Plan that was written up, and it's already been decided that we wanted to pursue this particular change. And so we want to decide what we want in terms of commercial or retail. But the definition or the meaning of a neighborhood-oriented business doesn't have anything about local ownership in it. Am I correct?
No. Correct.
Nothing whatsoever.
No, not local ownership.
It's a business that is intended to cater to the surrounding environment and neighborhoods, which then facilitates greater density of residency and supports the type of
It helps us to
better
thrive. It
transit
helps us to
issues.
thrive, so it trickles across a lot of
But it's the
areas.
transportation and the parking and the accommodating new residents to the city that is all facilitated by this small provision. Am I on the right wavelength?
Yes, you are.
Well summed
All I
up.
wanted to clarify.
Very well said.
okay, that was actually a really good discussion. We had a lot. Any other questions? No? Okay.
And next time you see this will be the exciting public hearing on it. So we do hope that you'll make a recommendation to the city council. And so, having said that, going once, going twice, are there any other questions or comments or thoughts that you would want us to research for next time? Because knowing that in the public hearing, if you have an aha moment, sometimes, as smart as we are, we won't perhaps know exactly the breadth of the answer if you happen to come up with it at the meeting, at the public hearing. So any last thoughts, or even if, you wake up in the middle of the night and say, oh, I got to tell Kristen that I have another question. The sooner you get them to us, the more successful I think the public hearing will be for you all, that you'll have all your questions answered before you have to think about a recommendation.
I think presenting us with a storyline of what some of the ideas might be that we would want to model towards would help us in understanding the differences between commercial, active commercial, retail, things that bring in economic vitality and the vibrancy, I think would help us formulate
And
what
we
we
have
want.
those. I'm just making sure that there's not one more thing that someone's thinking of, that they're thinking, well, please ask it now so that we can be prepared, versus the night of the public hearing. That's always so helpful to us.
Yeah.
Randy's pondering.
Well, okay.
Go for it.
One of the, safety and security was mentioned a couple of times. Is there any factor in this when the city is looking at encouraging people to walk around? Can the city of Issaquah state flatly that this is an absolutely safe place? I hear people that are not going into Seattle, period, because they're afraid to. Whether that's justified or not, that's an issue. People ask me about, what is this thing on Nextdoor about? And if you look at the police crime map that shows it's updated every 24 hours, it'll scare the heck out of you, because there's a lot of stuff, and it's misdemeanor stuff or it's whatever. But if you look at the locations, they're down here. They're in Old Town. So my question is,
I didn't know we had a.
What do we do to ensure that people understand that it is a safe place? I don't think that I think people are more afraid than they need to be to go places. So if we could get something into this that also points out that it's a great place to walk as a matter of, when the city does this. It's not a major issue, but I hear it
So
all the time.
it's coming, and it's in the plan, and it was part of the task force recommendation, but it is in the plan, and part of it is to do an inventory of the sidewalks and bicycles in Old Town, bicycle lanes in Old Town.
Part of it's lighting.
Pardon me?
Part of it's lighting.
Yeah, I know, I'm getting there.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And then to actually fill in those gaps for bike lanes and sidewalks, or make greenways, whatever it may be, to indicate that, cyclists are there. Another part was that people need to feel safer when they walk, so the recommendation from the task force was to provide more lighting to make it safer. So that is also in the plan, but these are, we can only do so many things at a time, so we're working on it.
That's great.
Okay.
If it's there, that's
It's there.
And actually, I like what Randy was just saying, and I just had an aha moment, so look how.
Good.
Like an intersection has a level of safety or a level of service, maybe we have a level of safety rating in Old Town and say, these are the safety ratings that are given for pedestrians and cyclists and crime, and then that way we can use that as a benchmark to present to our law enforcement and say, hey, these are the things that we need to keep that feeling.
I think the city,
think the police
that
already
IPD
has.
already has the numbers to compare safety in Issaquah and specific neighborhoods to other towns. I mean, I think there are standards
Right.
per, felonies per 100,000, whatever. And that's why I'm saying that I don't, from my personal experience, I don't think people understand how safe Issaquah is. But if you just look at the map and things like that, so the data is there, I believe, Ron, right now, that it's easily made use of.
So maybe sharing that data would help people.
No, sure.
A way to communicate that data might be part of the Old Town Code amendments.
The crime data?
Well,
That wouldn't really be part of our, as land use. It's certainly something that you can find on Randy's map, but it's not really part of. That's true. Let me correct, it's not Randy's map, the map that Randy mentioned.
It's something that should be routed through the economic development folk and to the Downtown Issaquah Association. And
See it more as a health and human services thing, but it's not
yeah,
really a point for us here.
no aha moment.
But it's fascinating. It's a fascinating thought.
I like it. Okay, any other questions back on topic now? No? All right, so I'm going to close the meeting out. Let's see, we have other business upcoming schedule. The next planning commission is going to be on
September 5th, and that's your public hearing on the Old Town Code amendments. And just to let you know, while we're talking about schedule, a new meeting was scheduled, if that's the proper grammar, in December. This is very exciting. December 5th, it will be a special meeting because we're giving you December 26th off. So we're replacing it with December 5th, and it will be on the sign code, and you guys are laughing. Did you guys want to be here on December 26th?
I dare you to be here on December 26th.
We'll show movies. It'll be movie night. But in your next packet, it will be corrected that there's a sign code meeting on December 5th that will be advertised as a special meeting because it's not a regular second and fourth PPC meeting. But those are the only two changes to the schedule that I know of at this point. And as I always do at this time of night, how many, just offhand, how many do we think will be here on September 5th? Not December, but September 5th. Oh, it looks like I have a quorum. Thank you so much. And even though you've said that, I'm still going to send out a meeting notice for you to RSVP because just that's who I am. Thank you for putting up with that.
Thanks, Trish.
Well
Thanks,
done.
Kristen. Thanks, Christopher and Kristen. Oh, Stephen. Sorry.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the meeting tonight at 8:18.
I was going to say, what does it say? Oh.